Gray slapped me in front of everyone just to show off for another guy. That same day, I deleted her number and blocked her on every platform. Everyone was stunned because Gray and I had been inseparable since we were kids. I had been in love with her for over a decade and even promised I would marry her one day. Gray eventually cornered me, demanding to know why I was acting this way. She asked if I was really being this petty over a single slap and told me to man up. I just sneered and asked her if she remembered what she said to someone else the day before it happened. I offered to refresh her memory, and her face turned pale as she lost her ability to speak. Gray and I were born in the same hospital in Seattle, with her arriving just a few hours before me. Our parents were neighbors in the same suburban neighborhood for years. Even after the old area was redeveloped, our families ended up moving into the same apartment building. She hit her growth spurt before I did, and she used to use her height to boss me around like I was her little sidekick. I was a quiet kid who got sick a lot, which made me an easy target for bullies by the time I reached 4th grade. A group of boys in my class started picking on me constantly. They would steal my textbooks, throw trash in my water bottle, and shove me from behind when I wasn't looking. When I went to the teacher in tears, he just asked why I was the only one getting picked on. He told me that maybe I didn't fit in and that I was partly to blame for the situation. After school that day, I told my parents everything while Mr. Miller, Gray's father, was over for a visit. He saw me crying and immediately went home to grab Gray. He told her that from then on, she was responsible for walking to school with me every single day. The next morning, Gray was waiting at my front door with her backpack ready to go. Once we got to school, she grabbed my hand and marched me straight into the classroom. She was taller than most of the boys, and as soon as she spotted the ringleader of my bullies, she dragged him into the alley behind the gym. I stood back and watched as she took on the entire group of boys until they were all on the ground crying. She warned them that if they ever touched Alex again, they would deeply regret it. Her voice was calm, but the intensity behind it shook me to my core. In that moment, the wind caught her long hair, and I saw her give a faint smile with those bright, piercing eyes. My heart started racing in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't understand what love was at that age, but I knew that seeing her made me feel safe and happy. From that day forward, rain or shine, Gray was always at my door so we could walk to school together. Even on days when she was too sick to attend class, she would still walk me to the gates and show up to walk me home. She was my constant protector throughout those early years. During our morning breaks, I followed Gray wherever she went like a shadow. She would often pretend to be annoyed, waving me off and threatening to stop walking me to school if I didn't leave her alone. I never listened, though, and happily stayed by her side, calling her name every step of the way. One day after school, she wasn't waiting outside my classroom like she usually was. I searched all her usual spots, but couldn't find her anywhere, and eventually, the janitor told me I had to leave the building. I walked toward the bus stop feeling completely dejected until I spotted her chewing gum at a nearby convenience store. She walked over to me, blowing bubbles and complaining that I had taken forever to get out of class. Then she pulled a piece of candy from her pocket and handed it to me with a smirk. That was how we grew up, always together and always looking out for one another. I had a massive growth spurt that summer and finally caught up to her height. Before long, I had outgrown her by several inches, and I started noticing a change in the way she looked at me. Whenever I helped her with her math homework, she wasn't even looking at the problems. She was just staring at me and smiling. On crowded buses where she had to stand, I would catch her shyly tugging on the edge of my jacket for balance. After we both got into the most prestigious high school in the city, her mother joked about how she had watched me grow up. She said I would make a perfect son-in-law and suggested we make things official once we started college. I knew Mrs. Davis was just teasing, but Gray turned bright red and hurried into my room to hide. All the adults saw her reaction, and my heart started pounding like a drum in my chest. I shouted out that I really did like Gray and that I was going to marry her one day, which made everyone burst into laughter. However, that special bond we shared began to crumble during our senior year of high school. On the very first day of class, while we were all waiting for our new textbooks, a guy with a bright, confident smile appeared at the door. Our teacher introduced him as Julian, a new transfer student. The teacher led him to the front of the room and told us to help him settle, since senior year was so important. The sunlight hit his face as he scanned the room, eventually locking eyes with me. He had the smug look that immediately made me feel uneasy. He spoke up, saying he had heard there was a total simp in this class who followed a girl around like a lost puppy. The room immediately filled with gasps and whispers as everyone turned to look at me. I stared back at him, swallowing hard as the tension in the room spiked. I didn't need to look around to know that every eye in the room was on me. Even though we were at a top-tier school, there were still a few people from our childhood who knew our history. They had always whispered behind my back about how I was still trailing after Gray like I did when we were kids. No one had ever had the nerve to say it to my face until that moment. Julian looked at me mockingly and said he had heard I was a pretty sensitive guy, asking if his words were upsetting me. He raised his eyebrows, clearly trying to provoke a reaction out of me in front of everyone. He went on to say how pathetic it was for a guy to spend all his time following a girl around like she was his mother. Gray finally had enough and slammed her hands on her desk, standing up so quickly that her chair flipped over with a loud bang. She looked furious as she glared at him. Julian turned his attention to her, his expression softening into something almost charming. He asked her if he was wrong, suggesting that she had probably been annoyed by my clingy behavior for a long time. Gray didn't defend me. She just pressed her lips together as if she were silently agreeing with him. The teacher barked for order, knocking on the blackboard to get everyone's attention. He told Julian to take the only empty seat, which happened to be right next to Gray. He then lectured the class about focusing on their studies and getting into good colleges instead of focusing on drama. He told us to leave the childish nonsense at the door and sent a few of us to the office to collect the new textbooks. As he spoke, he gave me a look that suggested he knew exactly what was going on. I took the hint and followed the other students out of the room to get away from the tension. When I got back with the books, my stomach dropped at the sight inside the classroom. The two of them, who had seemingly been at odds just minutes ago, were now standing close together and chatting. Julian looked up at me with a look of pure, smug satisfaction. After school ended, Gray packed her things and walked out of the room holding hand with Julian. I watched them disappear down the hallway before pulling a small cupcake out of my desk. It was her favorite kind, the one that wasn't too sweet, and I ate it in silence as the realization hit me. The events of the day played on a loop in my head, leaving a dull ache in my chest that wouldn't go away. Julian had effectively wedged himself between Gray and me. I knew right then that our relationship would never be the same again. Julian was a natural socialite, and within a few days, he had charmed the entire class. I couldn't wrap my head around how he and Gray had become so close so quickly. All I knew was that by the following week, she had stopped asking me to bring her breakfast. I tried one last time, placing a bag of her favorite breakfast sandwiches on her desk. Gray didn't even look up from her bag as she told me to take them back because she had already eaten. It was a cold rejection that I wasn't used to hearing from her. Julian held up a half-finished container of gourmet porridge and gave me that same annoying smile. He claimed he didn't know I was bringing food, but pointed out that Gray couldn't even finish what he had bought her. He told me quite clearly that my services were no longer required. I stared at the bowl in his hand as the reality of the situation finally clicked. Julian suggested that I should stop worrying about breakfast and focus on my grades instead of fussing over trivial things. He smirked and leaned back toward Gray, acting like he was doing me a favor. Gray finally looked at me and asked if I was actually angry about it. She told me that Julian was just trying to be helpful and that I shouldn't be so petty. Hearing her call me petty felt like a physical blow to the chest, leaving me completely stunned and unable to respond. I looked out the window as that familiar ache returned, sharper than before. I snapped, telling him that fine, I was the petty one and everything was my fault. My sudden outburst caused the whole room to go silent, while Julian just sat there sipping his porridge and mouthing the words she loved it at me. Gray's voice turned sharp, clearly annoyed by my sarcastic tone. I reached over and snatched the breakfast sandwiches off her desk, unable to take another second of it. She asked why I was yelling and if I really thought she would back down just because I was making a scene. Gray looked stunned because I had never spoken to her with that much venom before. She tried to reach for my hand to calm me down, but I shoved her away. She suddenly changed her tune, telling me not to be mad and asking for the food back, promising that I could keep bringing her breakfast like I always had. She held her hands out and spoke to me in that gentle voice she used to use. I looked past her and saw Julian glaring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated jealousy. I had never seen anyone look at me that way before, and from that day on, he made it his mission to make my life a living hell. It felt like I was a tiny boat caught in the middle of a violent storm with nowhere to run. While I excelled in my science classes, my English grades were a disaster, and the teacher frequently called me out in front of everyone. Julian saw this as the perfect opportunity to strike. Every time I tried to answer a question, Julian would mutter insults under his breath, calling me an idiot. His group of friends would always laugh along, their snickering filling the classroom. During group projects, he would roll his eyes the second I opened my mouth to share an idea. He would flatly disagree with everything I said, and his circle would immediately start mocking me until my ideas were turned into a joke. In the beginning, Gray would try to defend me, telling them to knock it off because we were all classmates. However, Julian always found a way to manipulate the situation. He would claim he was only pushing me for my own good, and Gray would go silent as if she actually believed him. Watching them laugh and flirt together felt like having needles driven into my chest every single day. Half the semester went by like this, and I was reaching my breaking point. My allergies flared up, leaving my eyes red and swollen, which Julian immediately used against me. I tried to slip out of class wearing sunglasses to hide my face, but he pointed me out to everyone. He shouted that I had probably been crying all day, and that was why I was hiding behind the shades. He snatched the glasses right off my face and yelled, "I told you so," to the entire room. Another wave of laughter broke out as everyone stared at my red eyes. Tears started to well up from the humiliation, but I fought with everything I had to keep them from falling. I told him to stop and asked if he really thought he was funny, but he just shrugged and told me to relax because it was just a joke. He called me sensitive again, and something inside me finally snapped. A surge of fury exploded in my chest, and I swung my fist, hitting Julian square in the jaw. He wasn't expecting it at all, and the force of the blow knocked him to the floor. He looked humiliated as he scrambled back to his feet, asking if I had a death wish. I noticed some beige residue on my knuckles and sneered, telling him that no wonder his skin was so thick since he was wearing so much foundation. I turned to go wash my hands, but Gray grabbed my wrist with a grip like iron. Her voice was cold as she demanded that I apologize to him immediately. I asked why I should apologize to a bully, and she snapped back that I was the one who turned it physical. She told me to apologize before she started to hate me. I looked at the girl I had loved for 10 years, now standing there defending a guy she barely knew. A deep sense of betrayal washed over me, and I shouted that I would never apologize. The second the words left my mouth, Gray swung her hand and slapped me across the face. The entire room went dead silent. I touched my stinging cheek and let out a dry, hollow laugh. I realized then that a decade of friendship meant nothing compared to a few months of infatuation. I grabbed my bag and walked out without a word, hearing Gray behind me frantically asking Julian if he was okay and offering to take him to the nurse. My face was burning, and the weight in my chest felt like lead. By the time I reached the school gates, it was pouring rain, but I didn't even bother looking for an umbrella. I walked through the streets of Seattle, soaked to the bone and ignoring the stares from people passing by. I finally made it home, dripping wet and shivering. On the coffee table sat a framed photo of our families at a theme park from the previous summer. I went straight to my room and opened the closet, seeing all the hoodies and shirts Gray had bought me over the years. I grabbed a large cardboard box and started throwing in everything that reminded me of her. I picked up the photo of just the two of us from my nightstand, lingering on her smile for a second before tossing it in two. I taped the box shut, carried it outside, and dropped it into the dumpster. The box hit the bottom of the bin with a heavy thud, signaling the end of an era. A few minutes after I got back inside, there was a knock at the door. I thought it was my parents, but when I opened it, Gray was standing there looking disheveled. She looked at me coldly and held up the box I had just thrown away. She pulled out our photo and demanded to know why I was throwing away everything she had ever given me. She seemed genuinely offended that I would discard our history so easily. I just smiled and told her that what I did with my belongings was none of her business. Her eyes drifted to the red mark on my cheek that was still visible. Her voice cracked as she claimed she hadn't hit me that hard, and she reached out to touch my face. I pulled away, dodging her hand. She had been my only real friend, the person I went to whenever life got hard, but that was over now. She started apologizing, saying she didn't mean to hit me so hard, but I cut her off and told her that from now on, we were nothing more than neighbors. She dropped the box and grabbed my hand, asking if I was really ending things over a single slap. She told me to stop being such a child and to act like a man instead of being petty. I just laughed at the irony and told her that we were officially done. Tears started streaming down her face as she tried to apologize again, but I told her I didn't want to hear it. I slowly pried her fingers off my hand and told her never to bother me again. Her face went from shock to confusion before settling into a bitter, defensive smile. She snapped that fine, it was my choice, and warned me not to come crawling back to her later. She turned and stormed off down the stairs without looking back. I stood in the doorway until I couldn't hear her footsteps anymore. Then I quietly closed the door on our past. By the next day, Gray and Julian were officially a couple. They brought in bags of candy and Starbucks for the whole class, making sure everyone knew they were together. I almost said something about her needing to focus on her exams, but then I realized it wasn't my place to care anymore. The entire class silently agreed to keep their relationship a secret from the teachers, acting as lookouts for the new couple. It wasn't surprising given how quickly Julian had charmed everyone with his outgoing personality. He was the golden boy of the senior class now. He was good-looking and especially popular with the girls in our grade. He would act like a hero, telling people to come to him if they were being bullied. He often bragged about hanging out with girls because they were cleaner and more emotionally intelligent than guys. He would make snide comments about people who were too sensitive or couldn't take a joke, clearly aiming his insults at me. While a few other students saw through his act and disliked him, Gray remained completely oblivious to his manipulation. She even had the nerve to encourage me to be friends with him. When I refused, Julian would play the victim in front of the girls, sighing about how he had accidentally offended me. He made it seem like I was the one being difficult and exclusionary. He claimed he was used to being the outsider, effectively twisting the narrative so that I looked like the bully. I was so frustrated that when I got home, I couldn't help but vent to my parents about how ridiculous the whole situation had become. My dad told me he understood and that he had dealt with people like Julian before. He advised me to just focus on my own life and stay as far away from him as possible. Right as he said that, we realized Gray was standing just outside our front door. Her expression darkened the moment she overheard us talking about her new boyfriend. She was always the type to get self-righteous about gossip. She walked in and told my parents that it wasn't okay for me to talk behind people's backs, leaving us in an incredibly awkward silence. I eventually realized that they had been building a connection for a while. Julian was actually pretty good at math, and since he sat next to her, he started tutoring her. She had always struggled with the subject, and that used to be my job. After the first quiz of the semester, she naturally gravitated toward him for help. Julian also knew a lot about pop culture and celebrity gossip, which made him an instant hit with Gray's group of friends. He was becoming the center of her entire social world. Gray's opinion of him shifted completely. He went from being the jerk who mocked people to the helpful, cheerful classmate. She had always hated guys who were too clingy, but for some reason, she didn't seem to mind it when it came to Julian. They spent their classes passing notes and giggling like they were the only two people in the room. After school, she would hop on the back of his bike and ride off with her group of friends. Seeing them like that used to make me feel incredibly bitter and heartbroken. I had spent so much time convincing myself they were just friends and that Gray actually had feelings for me. It turned out I was just delusional. One day, Julian announced to the whole class that they were officially dating while Gray sat comfortably on his lap. He made a comment about how they weren't like those people who used the childhood friend excuse to cling to someone like glue. He was clearly looking at me when he said it. He also added that he knew some people were jealous enough to try and snitch on them to the administration. He told the class that reporting them would just make the person look desperate and jealous. I just stared at him without showing any emotion while some students congratulated them. Others kept glancing at me, waiting for a breakdown since everyone knew my history with Gray. It was no secret that I was in love with her. Over the years, other girls had tried to give me love letters, but I had thrown every single one away because I only had eyes for Gray. We had always been each other's only person until Julian showed up. My lab partner gave me a nervous look, but I kept my head down and focused on my work. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife until Julian finally snorted and looked away. After that day, he and Gray became even more inseparable. Gray took her hair tie off and put it on Julian's wrist, teasingly telling him he was never allowed to take it off. They spent their time passing notes under their desks, and Gray would laugh so loudly it was like the rest of us didn't exist. At lunch, Julian always made sure to grab an extra serving of whatever she liked. Every afternoon, Gray would ride on the back of his bike with her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. After 10 years of being the only guy in her life, it was agonizing to watch at first. Eventually, though, the pain turned into a dull numbness as I got used to the sight. Just as I was starting to think we were finally out of each other's lives, Gray stopped me at the school gate one afternoon. She called my name in a low voice, and she had this strange expression that I couldn't quite read. She looked like she was caught between being furious and relieved. She told me that Julian had called in sick that morning, staring at me as if I should know why. I asked her what that had to do with me, and she got straight to the point, asking if I had jumped him. I froze for a second before letting out a cold, disbelieving laugh. I told her that I didn't even want to breathe the same air as that guy, let alone touch him. I had never been the type to go looking for a fight, especially not with someone as pathetic as Julian. I couldn't even stand the sight of him, so why would I seek him out? As far as I was concerned, him leaving me alone was a blessing I wasn't about to ruin. Gray didn't believe me, though. Her eyes were full of suspicion as she explained that he had walked her home the night before and promised to pick her up that morning. He never showed up, and she almost got marked late for class. When she finally got to school, she found out from the teacher that he was staying home because someone had jumped him. She demanded to know if it was me, and I told her she was being completely insane. I tried to walk away to avoid another pointless argument, but she grabbed my wrist and held on tight. She looked at me like I was a criminal, saying she knew I was upset about them dating, but that violence was going too far. She reminded me that I was the one who wanted us to be strangers. She told me that jealousy wasn't an excuse for assault. Then her voice softened, and she suggested that if I just apologized, she would pretend it never happened, and we could go back to the way things used to be. She sounded desperate for me to agree. I had finally reached my limit and asked her if she was actually serious. I told her to let go of me and reiterated that I hadn't done a thing to her boyfriend. I told her they could get married and have 10 kids for all I cared, as long as they both stayed the hell away from me. Gray looked pale and stunned, but she still wouldn't let go of my arm. Just as I was about to wrench myself free, another hand reached out and gently touched her shoulder. A girl in a sundress asked if this was really how she treated her classmates, and I turned to see Anna standing there. Anna had graduated the year before and was legendary at our school. Every guy had a crush on her. I had no idea what she was doing back on campus, but when she saw how confused I was, she just gave me a mischievous wink. Without missing a beat, she slid her arm through mine and leaned in close. Gray's face twisted in anger immediately. I took the opportunity to break free from her grip and started walking away, pulling Anna along with me without a second glance. That Wednesday during gym class, I was feeling a bit off, but I tried to ignore it. When the coach blew the whistle, I lined up to run laps with the rest of the guys. The girls had already finished their set and were standing on the sidelines watching us. Halfway through the second lap, my vision started to go dark and my legs felt like jelly. I realized too late that my blood sugar had crashed. My foot caught on the edge of the track, and I collapsed onto my knees in front of everyone. I heard people gasp as I went down, and then I heard someone running toward me. A familiar hand grabbed my arm to help me up, and I looked up to see Gray looking worried. She scolded me, asking if I'd skipped breakfast again and telling me I was in no condition to be running. She kept nagging me about taking better care of myself and offered to walk me to the nurse's office. I was already humiliated from falling in front of the whole class, and her hovering only made it worse. I yanked my arm out of her grasp, wanting nothing more than to be left alone. I told her not to touch me and that I could walk by myself. She snapped back, asking if I was really going to throw a tantrum when I could barely stand. She promised she would just drop me off at the nurse and then leave me alone if that's what I wanted. I gave a bitter laugh and asked her if she thought low blood sugar was some kind of terminal disease. I told her I just needed to sit down for a few minutes and that I didn't need a chaperone. Gray clenched her jaw and looked like she was about to explode. She asked why I was being so ungrateful, and I just told her she could believe whatever she wanted. She shoved my arm away and stormed off the track. When I finally made it to the nurse's office, there was only one other person there, sitting on a cot. It was Anna again, and I was genuinely confused as to why she was still hanging around the high school after graduating. She spotted me and gave me a huge smile, commenting on what a coincidence it was that we were both in the infirmary. I gave her a weak nod and then noticed that she was actually hurt pretty badly. Unlike my dizzy spell, her knee was wrapped in thick layers of gauze that were already soaked through with blood. The white bandage was turning a deep, dark red. She saw me looking and awkwardly explained that she had tripped over an uneven spot on the volleyball court. She tried to play it off as just a scrape, even though it looked much worse. She then asked if I was doing all right. I remembered that she had been the captain of the varsity volleyball team and was one of the best players in the state. It made sense that she was back on campus. The school probably asked her to help coach the new recruits for the season. Seeing that much blood made me a little lightheaded, but I was impressed by how tough she was being about it. She didn't seem fragile at all. In fact, she was the complete opposite. I found myself softening toward her as I told her I just had a blood sugar issue and that she was the one who needed a rest. Anna just nodded, her smile never wavering despite the injury. Because her knee required a lot of care, she ended up spending a lot of time in the nurse's office, and we started getting to know each other. She was incredibly easy to talk to and had a warmth that I wasn't used to. She had a way of making everyone around her feel at ease. One afternoon, while we were both sitting in the clinic, she looked at me shyly and suggested that maybe our friendship could become something more. I was completely caught off guard by her directness. I immediately started waving my hands in protest, telling her that I was buried in prep for my college entrance exams and couldn't think about dating. Anna didn't seem discouraged at all, though. A week later, she was back on her feet and walking without a limp. She started showing up every day during our long breaks to find me. She would bring me snacks or my favorite drinks and sit right next to my desk, chatting away. All the guys in my class would practically trip over themselves to offer her their chairs whenever she walked in. It didn't take long for the rumor to spread that the legendary Anna was dating a senior. Everyone was convinced we were a couple. No matter how much I denied it, people just gave me a knowing look and told me it was fine if I wanted to keep it secret. The guy who sat behind me leaned in one day, dying for some gossip. He asked me if it was true that Anna had six-pack abs. I just blinked at him, wondering why he thought I would know that, and told him I had no idea. He begged me not to hold out on them, saying they were all just curious because so many guys had tried and failed to date her when she was a student. He kept pressuring me to spill the details on what she was really like. Even my lab partner joined in, nudging me and saying that one of Anna's former classmates had confirmed she was in incredible shape. He assumed that since I was her boyfriend, I must have seen them. They kept asking me for details that I definitely didn't have. I actually stopped to think about it for a second. If I remembered correctly from seeing her in her volleyball gear, she was definitely toned. I mumbled that she was really athletic, which the guys immediately took as a confirmation of their theories. The guy behind me shouted out, asking how far we had gone, and I had to quickly cover his mouth to get him to shut up. I told them I had only seen her at practice and to stop making it sound like something it wasn't. Right then, a loud crash echoed through the room. Everyone turned to see Gray standing there, having dropped her glass water bottle, which had shattered into a million pieces. She looked deathly pale, as if she were in a trance. She slowly started to crouch down to pick up the broken glass. As she was picking up the shards, Julian suddenly yelled out her name, pointing at her hand. I looked over and saw that she had sliced her finger open. Blood was dripping onto the floor, but she just stared at it with a distant, vacant expression. Julian tried to help her, offering tissues to wrap the wound, but she yanked her hand away from him. In front of the entire class, she walked straight over to my desk. Even though the cut looked deep, she didn't even flinch as the blood continued to flow. She left a trail of blood across the floor as she stopped right in front of me. She looked me in the eyes and softly asked if I had a Band-Aid. She knew perfectly well that I always carried them in my bag, specifically because of her. When we were younger, Gray was a total tomboy who was always climbing trees and getting into trouble. She was constantly covered in scrapes and bruises. Back in middle school, a girl I had rejected got so angry that she decided to take it out on me. She sent her older brother to corner me in an alley after school, but Gray showed up swinging a massive stick and chased him off. After that, no one ever dared to mess with me. Later on, that same girl and her friend started following Gray instead. They pushed her in the hallway, right near the floor-to-ceiling windows. She wasn't expecting it and went crashing right through the glass, landing on the pavement outside. Luckily, we were on the first floor, so she wasn't killed, but she was covered in glass shards. Her arms were covered in dozens of small, bleeding cuts. When I found her, her white school shirt was already soaked through with red. She was clearly in agony, but she gritted her teeth and insisted she was fine and that it didn't even hurt. I was crying so hard I could barely see, feeling completely useless as I watched the blood soak through her sleeves. From that day on, I made sure to always have Band-Aids on me. I promised myself I would never let her get hurt like that again and started handling my own problems. I stopped telling her when people picked on me because I didn't want her getting into more fights on my behalf. Even though she was tough, I didn't want to keep relying on her for protection. She used to tease me for being overprepared with the Band-Aids, but I could tell she secretly loved it. Everything changed when Julian arrived. He saw a Hello Kitty Band-Aid fall out of my bag one day and started mocking me in front of Gray. He asked her what kind of grown man carries around girly bandages, and instead of defending me, she just smiled and nodded along with him. I snapped back to reality and looked at Gray, slowly shaking my head. I told her I wasn't a doctor and that she should go to the nurse if she was actually hurt. I pointed out that her legs worked fine and that she had a boyfriend who was perfectly capable of helping her. Gray didn't even look surprised by my coldness, but the last bit of color drained from her face. She gave a hollow, self-deprecating laugh and said she understood. Her eyes lost their spark as she walked away. Later that day, Julian cornered me behind the school and said we needed to talk. He wasn't smiling for once. He looked dead serious. I was beyond annoyed at this point. I was minding my own business and staying out of their way, so I didn't understand why they both kept seeking me out. They were the ones in a relationship, and I was just trying to move on. It felt like every day one of them was trying to have a moment with me. Julian stared at me with pure frustration, admitting he didn't understand what Gray saw in me. He called me a boring nerd and asked why she was still so hung up on someone like me. I almost laughed in his face and told him to get to the point. His expression darkened as he accused me of being smug. He said that even though Gray was officially his girlfriend, it was obvious that her heart was still stuck on me. He told me that seeing me with Anna had sent her into a tailspin and that she hadn't spoken to him in days. He couldn't understand why I was being so harsh, arguing that she had just gotten emotional and slapped me once, and that didn't justify cutting her out of my life. He accused me of being mad just because she had embarrassed me in public. He said my fragile pride was the only reason I was throwing away a lifelong friendship and called me the definition of selfish. He actually sounded like he was offended on her behalf. I let him finish his rant before calmly telling him that he didn't need to test me. I had no intention of reconciling with her. I laughed and pointed out how awkward it must be for him to be sent by his own girlfriend to check on her ex-best friend's feelings. I told him not to worry because I was going to keep treating her like a total stranger. I made it clear that once I throw something away, I never go back for it. I told him to give Gray a message. Stay as far away from me as possible. Julian looked a mix of guilty and humiliated for being caught in his lie. As I started to walk away, he called out one last time, asking if I was really doing all this just because of one slap. I didn't even turn around as I confirmed that yes, that was exactly why. Later that night, my phone rang with an unknown number. I picked it up without thinking, only to hear Gray's voice on the other end. She must have gotten a new burner phone just to reach me. I asked her if she was done stalking me and prepared to hang up. She begged me to just listen for a second, and for some reason, I stayed on the line. Her voice sounded hoarse as she told me she had finally read the diary. My heart stopped for a beat as I realized she was talking about the journal I had kept for years. It was the diary she had given me for my 10th birthday, and I had treated it like a sacred object. I had filled those pages over the years with every single thought and feeling I had ever had about her. It was essentially a decade-long love letter. I had documented every small moment we shared and every reason why I loved her. I used to dream about giving it to her on our wedding day as the ultimate confession of my devotion. On the other end of the phone, I could hear her voice starting to tremble. She told me she was so sorry and that she had no idea how deep my feelings actually went. She apologized for taking me for granted and claimed she had regretted the slap the second it happened. She insisted that she had never actually thought of me as just a brother. I cut her off and pointed out that she had had that diary for weeks and was only just now bothered to read it. The line went completely silent. I laughed and reminded her that she had never once cared enough to ask about my feelings when we were actually close. I told her she only cared now because she felt threatened by the rumors of me dating Anna. She had spent years ignoring me, but the moment she thought someone else might have me, she suddenly decided my feelings were important. I accused her of only opening that diary on a whim because she was bored or jealous. She tried to deny it, but I didn't let her. I told her very calmly that late apologies and sudden confessions weren't going to change anything about what she had done. I told her that her behavior was just making her look desperate and cheap. That diary was a relic of a person who didn't exist anymore, and she might as well throw it in the trash. I told her to stop calling me and hung up before she could say another word. My birthday was coming up, and my parents were planning a big party at our house. I was hesitant to invite Gray and her new crowd, but they had been keeping their distance lately, so I decided to be the bigger person and sent out the invitations to the whole class. Anna practically demanded an invitation as well, which I was happy to give her. On the night of the party, I dressed up and tried to enjoy myself. Gray showed up looking incredible, with Julian trailing behind her in a white suit, holding her hand tightly. The moment Julian saw me, he let go of her hand and wrapped his arm around her waist instead, marking his territory. Gray didn't even have an expression on her face. I didn't bother greeting them and walked straight over to talk to my parents' friends. The party was fun, but the social interaction was starting to wear me out. I stepped out onto the terrace to get some fresh air and look at the Seattle skyline. I heard footsteps behind me and knew exactly who it was without even turning around. We had spent too many years together for me not to recognize her gait. She stood behind me and asked if we could talk. I turned around and saw that her eyes were red and swollen from crying. I told her we could talk, but I made it clear I wanted this to be the last time. She looked devastated and gave a bitter laugh, asking if things really had to be this way between us. She realized then that no matter what she said, I wasn't going to forgive her. She told me she didn't understand how I could turn on her when I had loved her for so long. She finally admitted out loud that she had feelings for me too, and that we had been so close to finally being together. She asked why I was being so cruel now that she was finally ready to be with me. It was a confession I had waited a decade to hear, but it meant nothing now. It was too little too late. She asked if this was really all because of that one slap, and I nodded without a second of hesitation. I told her that yes, it was because of the slap, but more importantly, it was because of what I had heard the day before it happened. I knew the slap wasn't just an emotional outburst. The day before it happened, I had seen Julian giving her a ride home, but they had taken a detour away from our neighborhood. I had followed them out of curiosity and ended up at a restaurant downtown. I watched from a nearby table as Gray and her friends sat with Julian. They were all gossiping about how I had been by her side since elementary school and calling us childhood sweethearts. I sat there in the shadows, listening to every word they said. Her friends asked if I actually liked her, and they all laughed because it was so obvious. They pointed out that I had been chasing her for 9 years and asked why she hadn't said yes yet. My heart tightened as I waited for her response, and she just gave a light, careless laugh. She told them that while she liked me, she wasn't interested in dating someone so boring and dull. Her friends called her savage and asked if she was worried that I would eventually get tired of being strung along and move on to someone else. She confidently told them that guys like me never leave and that once I was hooked, I would cling to her for dear life. Julian chimed in, grinning as he agreed that I was the type of guy who didn't know when to give up. Julian bet them that no matter how badly Gray treated me, I would keep coming back as long as she was occasionally nice to me. He mocked the way I looked at them, saying I still had puppy dog eyes, even though they were clearly together. He suggested that she could slap me in public and I would still forgive her if she just said sorry afterward. He challenged her to try it, betting that I would still come crawling back to her like a loyal dog. The whole table started egging her on. I held my breath as I waited for her to shut them down, but instead, she clearly said, "Sure, let's try it." Back on the terrace, Gray was trembling as she tried to explain that she only said it to save face in front of her friends and that she didn't actually mean it. I told her that her excuse was pathetic. I reminded her how much she used to hate people who talked behind others' backs, and asked her how she was any different from the people she used to despise. She had no answer, and her face went completely white. I let out a long sigh, realizing that the anger and heartbreak had finally vanished, replaced by a cold indifference. It felt like I was listening to a story about two different people. I told her I knew she liked me, but I also knew she was easily influenced by people like Julian. I told her it was natural that she wanted to impress the new, exciting guy. She only liked me because of our history and because I had spent my entire life devoted to her. I was the safe choice, but Julian was the one she wanted to show off for. I realized that we were never actually a good match. She might have found me attractive, but she also found me boring and unassertive. She wanted someone like Julian, someone who was loud, confident, and presentable to her social circle. If it hadn't been Julian, it would have been the next charming guy who came along. I told her that she was free to date whoever she wanted, but she had no right to use me as a stepping stone to boost her own ego or impress her new boyfriend. I gave a cold laugh and asked her who she thought she was to lay a hand on me. I couldn't believe she had thrown away a decade of friendship just to impress a guy she had known for all of 5 minutes. She looked completely broken as the weight of my words hit her. I had exposed her most selfish impulses, and she knew there was no way to defend herself. She didn't even try to argue anymore. She just stood there in a daze, a single tear rolling down her cheek as she realized what she had lost. She asked me if I still loved her, and I told her that I never loved her. She looked like I'd just stabbed her, her lips turning white as she stared at me in total shock. I looked her straight in the eye and prepared to tell her the final truth. I told her that I had cared for her for a long time because of how she protected me when we were kids. But that love was just a fantasy I had built in my own head. It was a one-sided devotion that didn't actually require her to be a good person. I told her that I had finally let that fantasy go. When she asked why, I told her very simply that every time I looked at her, my face still stung from her slap. I said it without a hint of emotion, and she looked like she was about to faint. Not long after that, Gray broke up with Julian. I never found out the exact reason, but Julian ended up transferring to a different set of classes just a few weeks before our final exams. The golden couple had completely imploded. Gray became a completely different person after the breakup. She cut off all her old friends and started following me around again. She would bring me breakfast every morning and rush to the cafeteria to save me a seat at lunch, trying to recreate our past. She would buy me food and follow me home after school, insisting that she just wanted to walk with me. It was like we were back in elementary school, except this time she was being even more attentive and kind than she had ever been before. Whenever I asked her what she was trying to accomplish, she would just look at me with those sad, puppy dog eyes and stay silent. Eventually, she told me she just wanted to make things right and take care of me. No matter how much I ignored her, she wouldn't leave me alone. It was exhausting dealing with her constant presence. Around that time, my parents' company offered them a position in London, which happened to be near where my mother grew up. We decided as a family that we would move as soon as I finished my senior year. I kept the move a secret until the very last minute. One weekend, I sent out a few goodbye texts to my closest classmates. Gray was the last person to find out, and she cornered me to ask if I was ever planning on coming back to Seattle. I didn't give her an answer. During the final weeks, we all stayed home to cram for the SATs. On the day of the actual exam, a rumor started circulating that Gray had spent the entire time writing my name over and over again on her answer sheet. Because she had essentially sabotaged her own exam, she didn't get into any of the colleges she applied to and had a plan for a gap year. The day my acceptance letter from NYU arrived, my parents and I finished packing the last of our things in the moving truck. As we drove away, I saw Gray chasing after our car in the rearview mirror. She ran as fast as she could, reaching out toward the car and screaming something I couldn't hear. I just sat in the passenger seat and watched her get smaller and smaller. She was sobbing, her face a mask of pure desperation as she begged me not to leave. She screamed that she couldn't live without me. I saw Julian try to catch her and hold her up, but she violently shoved him away, her eyes never leaving our car. The wind was so loud that it drowned out her final cries for me to stay. The girl who had been my entire world for 10 years eventually tripped and fell. She stood back up, shaking, but by then we were too far away. She became a tiny speck in the distance until she vanished completely. I heard updates about her occasionally from old friends back home. Some said she was a shell of her former self, spending her gap year in a state of total depression. Others said she had spiraled out of control, partying constantly and hanging out with a dangerous crowd. There were even rumors that she had become a recluse, doing nothing but studying so she could get into the same university as me. I stopped listening after a while. Anna and I both ended up at NYU, and it wasn't long before we officially started dating. For the first few years of college, I would get a package every year on my birthday. There was never a name on the box, but I recognized the Seattle return address immediately. I never opened them. I just marked them as refused and sent them back to her. By my junior year, I finally told Anna that I loved her. She insisted on making us Facebook official, and we posted photos of our relationship all over Instagram and Facebook. After that, the yearly birthday packages finally stopped showing up. It was a relief to finally have that chapter of my life closed for good. It should have ended years ago, but I was finally free. This was the end of my past with Gray and the true beginning of my new life with Anna.